In an extraordinary moment that underscores just how serious the Greenland crisis has become, the United States Congress has done something unprecedented, introduced legislation specifically designed to prevent the president from invading a NATO ally. This morning, Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Democratic Senator Shaheen of New Hampshire unveiled the NATO Unity Protection Act bipartisan legislation that would prohibit the Pentagon and State Department from using any federal funds to occupy, annex or seize control of Greenland or any other NATO member's territory without their consent. The timing is deliberate and strategic. This legislation drops just hours before a critical White House meeting tomorrow, where Secretary of State Marco Rubio will sit down with Danish and Greenland officials to discuss Trump's territorial demands. So what does this congressional intervention actually mean? Can it stop Trump? And why is this moment unprecedented in American foreign policy history? Let's break down the legislative bombshell that just changed the entire Greenland crisis. Let me start with what Congress is actually doing. The NATO Unity Protection Act is remarkably direct in its language. According to the bill introduced this morning, it would bar the Department of Defense and the Department of State from using any appropriated funds to blockade, occupy, annex, or otherwise assert control over the territory of any NATO member state without that country's consent. This isn't symbolic. This is Congress using its most powerful constitutional tool, the power of the purse. Senator Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire who serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, explained the rationale clearly. This bipartisan legislation makes clear that U.S. taxpayer dollars cannot be used for actions that would fracture NATO and violate our own commitments to NATO. Her co-sponsor, Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, added crucial context. As she noted in her statement, Alaska shares Arctic waters with Greenland. Murkowski understands the strategic importance of the region. But she's drawing a line. Strategic value doesn't justify abandoning America's alliance commitments. The bipartisan nature of this legislation cannot be overstated. In today's hyper-polarized Congress, finding agreement on foreign policy is rare. Finding agreement to directly constrain a president from your own party is nearly unheard of, but that's exactly what's happening. A Republican senator is joining with a Democrat to tell President Trump, "You cannot use American military resources to seize territory from a NATO ally." The bill has already been introduced and will be referred to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Additional co-sponsors from both parties are expected to join in the coming days. Now here is what makes this moment truly extraordinary. This has never been done before in modern American history. Congress has certainly challenged presidential war powers in the past. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, passed over President Nixon's veto after Vietnam, required congressional approval for sustained military operations. The Boland Amendments in the 1980s restricted funding for covert operations in Nicaragua, but those were about wars with adversaries. This is about preventing military action against an ally. Think about what that means. For the first time, the legislative branch is moving proactively to prevent the executive branch from potentially invading a military partner, a founding member of NATO, no less. The constitutional framework here is fascinating. The president is commander-in-chief with broad authority over military operations. But Congress controls appropriations. Every dollar the military spends must be authorized and appropriated by the legislative branch. The NATO Unity Protection Act exploits that constitutional division of power. It doesn't tell the president he can't order military action. It says the Pentagon and State Department cannot spend money on it. That's a crucial legal distinction. Trump could theoretically still issue orders, but executing those orders would require funding for troop deployments, logistics, equipment, operational support. Without appropriated funds, military action becomes logistically nearly impossible. As Senator Shaheen emphasized, this is also about treaty obligations. The NATO treaty was ratified by the Senate in 1949, giving it the force of law under the Constitution's Supremacy Clause by threatening military action against Denmark. Trump isn't just violating diplomatic norms, he's potentially violating US law. The legislation essentially says, Article 5 means something. Mutual defense commitments are not optional, and Congress will enforce them if the president won't. But there's another dimension to this story that makes the timing particularly significant. Tomorrow, Wednesday, January 15, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is scheduled to meet at the White House with Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen and Greenland Foreign Minister Vivian Motzfeldt. Vice President J.D. Vance is also expected to attend. These are the first direct high-level diplomatic talks since Trump escalated his Greenland demands to include threats of military force. And now those talks happen with this legislation as the backdrop. Think about the negotiating dynamics. Danish and Greenland officials walk into that meeting knowing that the U.S. Congress, including members of Trump's own party, has publicly moved to constrain him. That fundamentally changes their leverage. If Trump tries to pressure them with implicit or explicit military threats, Danish diplomats can point to Capitol Hill and say, "Your own legislature is telling you no, this doesn't mean the talks will succeed or fail, but it does mean the Trump administration enters those negotiations politically weakened." And weakness at the negotiating table often produces either compromise or stalemate, not capitulation. The question is whether Trump views this as embarrassing interference that hardens his position or as a face-saving opportunity to pivot toward a more diplomatic approach while blaming Congress for constraining his options. We'll know more after Wednesday's meeting, but the congressional intervention has undeniably shifted the diplomatic landscape. Let's zoom out to the broader alliance implications. For weeks, European NATO allies have been watching this crisis with growing alarm. The question on everyone's mind, if the United States can threaten Denmark with military action, what does Article 5 actually mean for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, or any smaller NATO member? Congress's response provides a partial answer. Not all of the United States government supports threatening allies. That matters enormously for alliance management. One of NATO's core strengths has always been its credibility. Allies must believe that an attack on one truly is an attack on all. That belief is what deters Russian aggression against vulnerable members. Trump's Greenland threats undermine that credibility. This congressional action is an attempt to restore it not completely, but partially. European defense ministers who have been quietly discussing contingency plans for defending Greenland from potential US action now have evidence that America's political system includes checks on presidential power. That may not be enough to fully reassure them, but it's more than they had yesterday. At the same time, the very fact that such legislation is necessary reveals how damaged transatlantic trust has become. In a healthy alliance, you don't need laws preventing the most powerful member from invading other members. The fact that Congress felt compelled to introduce this bill is itself evidence of NATO's crisis. The legislation is both a defense of the alliance and a symptom of its fracture. So where does this go from here? The immediate question is whether this legislation can actually pass both chambers of Congress. It's been introduced in the Senate and will go to the Foreign Relations Committee. Hearings are likely within the next few weeks given the urgency. The bill would need to pass the Senate, then the House, and then either secure Trump's signature or override his likely veto. That's a high bar in any circumstances, but the political calculus is interesting. This is an election year, midterms are in November. Senators and representatives will be asking themselves, do I want to go on record voting to allow the president to invade NATO allies? Or do I want to vote to defend the alliance? That is not an easy vote for Republicans who generally support Trump but also care about America's alliances and global credibility. For Democrats, it is simpler. This is an opportunity to challenge Trump's foreign policy while defending institutions and treaty obligations. The legislation may not pass, but even if it doesn't, it has already accomplished something significant. It has put every member of Congress on record about whether NATO commitments matter more than presidential territorial ambitions. The NATO Unity Protection Act represents a remarkable moment in American foreign policy, the first time Congress has moved to legally prevent a president from potentially invading an ally. Whether it passes or not, the message has been sent, not just to Trump, but to NATO allies, to adversaries watching for Western division, and to the American public. Alliance commitments still matter to significant portions of the U.S. government, even when the president threatens them. Tomorrow's White House meeting between us, Danish, and Greenland officials now happens in a very different political context. The question is whether that context produces diplomatic progress or further entrenchment. What's your analysis? Do you think Congress can actually constrain Trump on Greenland? Does this legislation help or hurt diplomatic negotiations? And what does it say about NATO's future when such a law is even necessary? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want continued coverage of this developing crisis, including analysis of Wednesday's diplomatic talks, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We post breaking geopolitical analysis daily at AM and PM Est for Strategic Signal Report. This is the story of how Congress just tried to save NATO from its own leader.